Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to another weekly live stream with yours truly, Dr. Sarah L. Webb. I took a break last week, so hopefully you all got to use your hour for something else productive or restful. But I'm back to finish out the second half of this ongoing fall series on colorism in media, or colorism and media. And this week we're on episode 8 and we're focusing on children's media. Yes, this is one of the ones that you all voted for way back before I started the series. I did a survey to see which subcategory of media and colorism you all were interested in, and many people voted on children's media. And understandably so. So before we dive into the content and things that I want to share, as well as your comments and questions, please introduce yourself in the chat. Say hello if you can, and let me know where you're tuning in from. Let me know what your zodiac sign is. I'm always representing Gemini gang, but I love all the signs. And I said where you're tuning in from. Yes, okay. And as you're doing that, saying hello in the chat, especially if this is your first time joining me, I want to share some of my intentions and alignment for this live series as well as this particular episode. So first, I always like to have fun. I've been saying more and more recently that I want to have fun doing my work because it is a lot of work. So why not let it be fun? We also want to make genuine connections in real time. So I show up as I am, and I hope that you do the same. You are come as you are, be authentic to who you are in the conversation. And then I also want to have creative conversations that dig deeper, that go beneath the surface. So I said throughout the series that we go beyond the idea that it's just entertainment, right? Like it's entertainment, but it's also education, it's also conditioning, it can also be propaganda, right? So we don't like to just skim the surface, we like to dive deep. And then lastly, we want to facilitate healing and transformation for ourselves as well as the collective society, all right? So if those values are aligned with your values and why you're here, your intentions, your purpose, your why for talking about colorism and having conversations around colorism, then welcome. You are in the right place, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and look at my chat a little bit. Hey, Michael, welcome. This says, hi, Dr. Sarah. I've been love and hip hopping. I got to show this one on the screen. Michael says he's been love and hip hopping. Yes. I gotta shout out myself for being featured on the Love and Hip Hop MTV YouTube channel and their other social platforms. If you haven't seen that conversation, I should link it in the show notes, not the show notes, in the caption under this video. But yes, who else is joining us? Danny. Hey, Danny, welcome back. Hello from Maryland, and you are a Libra. We are in Libra season to you. So happy birthday to you. Happy birthday season. We have Jasmine Rosewater. Yay, I finally caught a live. You're the best. Grateful for your work. Hey, Jasmine. I love your name, Rosewater. I really like Rosewater, like the actual stuff, the substance. All right. So if you are not able to use the chat, but you're still saying hello, you're still waving at the TV or whatever, I'd like to greet you as well. So we always start with one of my throwback photos. And since we're talking about children and media and colorism, I gotta do a throwback photo of myself as a child, okay? And when we talk about media and colorism specifically, these other two people have been such a significant part of my experiences with the media growing up. These are my older siblings. Yes, I am the youngest of 3. I have an older sister who's the middle child, and I have an older brother who's the oldest. And we have so many shared memories of watching TV together. We have so many shared memories of listening to music together, watching movies together. And our family has so many inside jokes related to this, right? Whether it's Ninja Turtles, Captain Planet, Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers, the Twilight Zone marathon at the end of the year. We just have a lot of shared memories as a family, including my mom, but definitely us as siblings. Waking up on Saturday mornings, watching David the Gnome. I could go on and on and on, right? But also, I like this picture because it depicts the skin color differences between me and my siblings as well. And so speaking of childhood, I always tell this story of how when I first started talking about colorism over a decade ago, having conversations with my mom, and she revealed to me an experience that I had that she remembers. I don't actually remember it, but based on her recounting this story to me, we were visiting extended relatives, and some of the extended relatives were complimenting my sister, who you see featured there in the middle, and saying how pretty she is and how my mom should watch closely for her because she's going to break some hearts one day. And then my younger 5-year-old self, my mom said she heard me whispering, well, that's because she's light skinned. And what I always tell people is that for me to be able to recognize the pattern and articulate the pattern at 5 years old, that means I had seen it often enough before then to know what it was, right? Because people often say, oh, well, they're too young to understand. Oh, I'll talk to her when she gets older. And I always tell that story to demonstrate to people how early it starts. So the title of this is It Starts Early. It starts way earlier than a lot of adults, than a lot of parents and caregivers like to acknowledge. So again, for me to be able to say that at 5, that meant I had seen it often enough to really understand skin color dynamics, to really understand how the adults around me were placing greater value on my sister's skin tone compared to mine, okay? So shout out to my older sister Jandelle and my older brother Anthony, my besties, best friends for life. Also the survey, so I'll always share the survey, right? So I'll come back to the childhood stories, but today's survey, or this week's survey, was about which form of children's media does a better job of representing diverse skin tones. And I have to say, like, definitely generationally speaking, I think children growing up today in the 2020s have far more options, have way more diversity of skin color and race and ethnicity and all types of identity than I had growing up in the 80s and 90s. But according to the 47 votes, the biggest one was by far storybooks, right? So children's books. And I think I would agree with that. I think if I took this survey, and I can't remember if I did or not, I would also say storybooks. In second place was toys and games. So thinking about dolls and figurines and that sort of thing at 15%. And then TV shows and movies was in third place at 11%. And then we had a few people who think that other types of media play a role and or have diversity of skin tones. And then I'd like to shout out really quickly Susie from the Rugrats. Anybody remember Susie from the Rugrats? So I'm featuring Susie here as an example, yes, of one of the TV shows we watched growing up, but also because I remember, y'all, I can speak to remembering the feeling of seeing Susie in an episode of Rugrats and the importance of representation, the impact that seeing someone who resembles you as a young Black girl, it made a difference. I remember feeling so proud. I remember feeling seen, even, as an 8-year-old, however old I was when Rugrats came out. And so it really is, like, as much as I enjoyed the Rugrats regardless, there was something about when Susie came on the scene, when Susie knocked on the door, when Susie came to visit, when she was, and the way she was portrayed as, being the older kid, right? She was older than the other kids, and so they looked up to her. They really respected her. I just have, like, really fond memories of, like, being so proud, right? That the little girl in the cartoon that looked like me was seen as such a respected character. She was seen as the cool one, you know what I mean? And so again, that's just an example for me of how representation mattered to me growing up and why I believe it still continues to matter. And speaking of children's media, I did just Thursday. This was Thursday. My mom and I went to see LeVar Burton speaking at the University of Texas in Arlington. And we definitely grew up watching the Reading Rainbow, right? I didn't grow up watching Star Trek as much, but we definitely grew up watching Reading Rainbow, which was children's programming in the 80s, right? Hosted by LeVar Burton. But even before Reading Rainbow, right? Like backing up to his very first role, his debut role in Roots. Anybody saw Roots? Raise your hand if you've seen Roots, the miniseries by Alex Haley, right? So that was our first introduction to LeVar Burton. And I remember one of the things I'll say about my childhood that I am going to speak to when I give advice and tips on, interacting with media when we have kids or when we are involved in kids in our life in some way, is that my mom often had us watching informative TV shows about Black history, about American history, about racism, about the civil rights movement, right? All sorts of movies and programming like Roots. I remember my mom being very intentional about wanting us to see it. I remember we were living in Kenner, Louisiana, about a 5-minute drive from the New Orleans airport, okay, in this little duplex, 2727 Akron Avenue, okay. I remember it had the brown 80s carpet and all the things. We had like a record player. I would go home after school and listen to vinyl records of Bobby Brown, right? So I remember watching Roots, right? We had this like brown plaid couch. Y'all remember the 80s, okay? And I remember hearing about Roots coming on. And I remember that night, my mom was like, oh, y'all have to watch this. I want y'all to watch this story. And I remember just sitting in that living room in that duplex and watching LeVar Burton as Kunta Kinte, and, you know, him saying that his name was Kunta Kinte, even though they were trying to, you know, using violence to get him to assimilate his name, right? And so that just had such an indelible mark on my consciousness, even before age 10, right? Because we left Kenner when I was 7. So this was like pre-age 7, watching Roots and having this sense of deeper understanding, deeper pride, deeper recognition of who I was, who I am, where I come from. And so part of what I'm going to say when I get to my tips and suggestions and strategies portion is to start young, and to not assume that your children are too young to have certain conversations, that they're too young to be exposed to the truth of what this country, of what this world has been and what it has done to various groups of people, okay? Before I continue, I do want to play a clip from the LeVar Burton interview that speaks more directly to the approach that they took to in producing Reading Rainbow. So let's see if this plays. Hopefully the sound is good.
You know, the 80s was a different time. and we made a conscious decision to pace the show slowly, almost pastorally. We didn't use quick cutting. We sort of leaned into the idea that a connection with literature is like taking a deep breath.
Okay, so I loved that idea that a connection with literature is like taking a deep breath. So when we think about the survey, right, where people said books and storybooks have some of the best representation of diverse skin tones, I also like the idea of books, and I actually alluded to this when I talked about other forms of media, because books allow us to take our time, right? And so one of the people in the chat said that even when they're watching TV, they pause the TV show and talk about what's going on in the TV show, right? But the idea of TV and movies and music, they're not designed for you to stop in the moment and process what's going on, right? But with storybooks, you control the pacing, which you control like how you deliver the message. You can control your commentary on the message. And so reading a storybook to a child versus like sitting through a movie, you can allow them to ask questions. You can ask them questions. You can say, what do you think is going to happen next? And they can pause and tell you to go back to another page, or they can say, can you read that part again? You know what I mean? And so it's just, I think not only do storybooks themselves have more variety, but also the way that you can engage in the content is more varied as well. And it allows for more teaching, right? More intentionality in terms of how you engage with the story with a child, okay? All right, so let's get back to where I left off. So this is based on, what I'm gonna share next is based on a blog post that I wrote in the early days, right? So the timestamp here is July 2013, where I talked about when should parents discuss colorism with children. And the reason why I wrote this blog post is because I was hearing parents say things like, oh, well, my children aren't going to understand. They're too young to understand, right? I don't want to put those ideas in their head when they're so young, right? And so I'm emphasizing this because I think too many parents have a passive reactive approach to talking about things like racism. They wait for their child to come home crying because they were called the N-word to have that conversation, when really we should be having that conversation with our children, you know, early on, even before, in some instances, even before they have language, right? We can still be doing this work. And I'll talk more about that. But I'll also share that beyond this broadcast, that the website colorismhealing.com has a lot more resources. If you just Google things like parents or children or kids on the blog, that you can do a deep dive of other content I've shared. But for today, I've pulled out a few quotes, so please bear with me because I'm going to read these, but I think they're very insightful. So the first one is from the University of Michigan, and the author, the researchers were sharing that children are not colorblind, right? Nor is their understanding of racial identity superficial. Children as young as age 3, okay, so in my mother's memory, I was 5. This researcher would suggest that as young as age 3, children have a complex understanding of the way in which society constructs racial categories, and that understanding goes well beyond surface appearances. Simply telling kids that race doesn't matter isn't going to be very effective, since they obviously think it does in a couple of non-trivial respects. And so I'll pause here to say, especially to white parents, okay? Because I feel like white parents take this approach a lot, and they think, oh, well, we just tell our children that it doesn't matter and we love all colors, right? And that's talking, first of all, it's like talking out of both sides of your mouth, right? Because how do your actions align with that or misalign? But also, because of all the messaging that your children receive, it's not enough for you to just say, oh, well, all people are nice. We like all people, right? You have to actually unpack what they're observing and the reality around them. So going further, this says, to combat racism, we need to understand its basis. It's not just a problem affecting a few bigots. It's a way of thinking about the kinds of people there are in the world that goes far beyond surface appearances and gives rise to invidious comparisons. And it's a way of thinking that preschoolers have already begun to develop, okay? So I underscored the idea of comparisons. Hey, I'm on my live. Yeah. Speaking of my siblings, one of them just burst in the door on the live stream. All right. But back to this quote. I underline the idea of comparisons because it's very easy and early on, just like with me and my lighter skinned sister who just burst in the door, for children to understand, like, okay, these people look differently than me and people are treating them differently, right? And so kids are naturally making these comparisons themselves based on what they're seeing in TV, right? Like all of my school teachers are white. That is telling me something. All of my doctors and dentists and nurses are white. That is telling me something as a child, okay? All right, let's keep going. Thanks for bearing with me. I know I said I wasn't going to be as research heavy this time around, but I think, y'all are going to hang in there with me. Okay, so this one came from an article. I can't read the article title because the live stream controls are covering it. But it was written by Erin Winkler, and she says, children pick up on the ways in which whiteness is normalized and privileged in U.S. society. This is what I tell people about racism, colorism. You don't have to explicitly teach your child to be racist. Okay, and I push back even with other Black people when Black people say, oh, they're racist because their parents taught them to be racist. I'm like, well, that's true for some people. Some people's parents do explicitly teach them to be racist. But the vast majority of people, especially white people, who end up being racist and having racial biases, it's because their parents were not teaching them to be anti-racist, right? And so if you take the stance of, I'm just not going to teach my child anything, they are kind of on a track going downstream towards becoming racist. You can't just take a passive approach and expect or hope that your child will be anti-racist or anti-sexist or anti-colorist, right? So you can not teach anything and your child will likely pick up on racist, sexist, bigoted beliefs. And so if you want your children to not have that, you have to be explicitly and intentionally teaching them how to counteract those things. What does this mean? Consciously or unconsciously, middle-class white culture is presented as a norm or a standard in the United States in terms of appearance, beauty, language, cultural practices, food, and so on. I'm going to pause here because when we think about things, I think about shows like Bluey, and shows like Peppa Pig, and shows like Garfield, or shows like other shows with non-human characters, shows like Thomas the Train, or what's the one with the dogs? Not Wonder Pets, yes, but the Paw Patrol, right? Where you're like, oh, all the main characters are animals. So race is not a factor in this show, right? Because the characters are animals. But even a turtle, even a bear, even a duck, even a Chip and Dale rescue ranger can still be racialized to represent white culture as being the norm, right? So in things of how people talk, again, even though it's an animal, it still takes on the dialect of Midwestern white people, right? Even though it's an animal, it's still eating and preparing food that we associate with like Midwestern white culture, right? And so how can, even when the characters supposedly don't have a racial identity, in the case of like animal characters, how are they still normalizing whiteness? How are they still normalizing white culture, right? And making that the norm, making that seen as desirable or preferred. Okay, and then I'll finish this. Tatum, 1997, argues that this message is so prevalent in our society, it is like smog in the air. Sometimes it is so thick, it is visible. Other times it is less apparent, but always, day in and day out, we are breathing it in. For very young children, this smog comes in the form of picture books, children's movies, television, and children's songs, which all include subtle messages that whiteness is preferable, okay? I know I've been throwing a lot at y'all, so I'm gonna pause a little bit, let that sink in. I'm gonna check on the chat right quick before I continue. Let me bring this off. All right. I was doing a lot. Hello, hello, hello. Saturday morning cartoons. Yes, Michael. Okay. It was like, oh my, you couldn't get us to wake up early for school, but get me to wake up early on a Saturday to watch cartoons. I'm there. K. Michelle says, Susie. Yes, Susie was that girl. Okay. She was it. She was the it girl. I loved it. Marva says, having light skin has always felt like a burden, not a gift. Okay, well, you can unpack that, Marva Smith, but that's off topic right now. So I'm not really addressing that type of question at the moment. Michael says, yes, seen Roots and Roots, the Next Generation, and got the book. Okay. Yes, that, I think that miniseries, that book, that work really kind of is iconic in terms of thinking about and confronting and grappling with the history of this country. Let's see. Born Earth says, yep, Kunta Kinte. I understood the concept of people getting to name themselves from a very early age. Yeah, this is Born Earth. Were you here on I think I remember that name from previous live streams as well. But yeah, the power of getting to name yourself. And also for me, I think that scene, right? And the fact that they took the time to portray it in that way helped me to understand the ways that distancing us from our culture, that severing us from our culture, severing us from things like our naming practices and our language was part of an oppressive tool, right? And so when we think about assimilation and respectability politics and how a lot of Black people across the diaspora find shame in their names or their naming practices, or they find shame in their dialects and the way they use language, right? Like it harkens all the way back to that, and where people were literally using physical violence in that case, but now they use social violence. Now they use psychological violence to still make us think that there's something wrong with these aspects of our culture and identity. Michael says sibling fun. Yeah, we have a good time. All right, so let me get back to the presentation piece here. So one other comment from the Winkler article is a lesson for caregivers, okay? So if you are in the care, or if a young child is in your care, something to consider. Do not shush children or shut down the conversation. A lot of times, I'm going off script here, a lot of times because the adult is uncomfortable with the conversation, because the adult doesn't feel like they have enough answers or have enough insight or knowledge, they just shut it down and they tell the child, oh, we're just not going to talk about that, right? So don't let your discomfort stop your child from having an opportunity to learn and be curious, okay? But she goes on to say, instead, engage in open, honest, frequent, and age-appropriate conversations about race, racial differences, and even racial inequity and racism. Research has shown that such conversations are associated with lower levels of bias in young children. Let go of the notion that you are, quote unquote, putting ideas in their heads by talking about race. As we have seen, research shows that young children notice race and draw conclusions about difference on their own. And bringing it back to colorism, one of the things children are going to notice about race is differences in skin tone. You can't convince me that differences in skin tone, differences in hair style, hair texture are not going to be a part of what children are noticing and being curious about, and noticing how people respond to people with one skin tone versus another, okay? So what I'll share here, or just, this is just additional articles I've written. One of them was written in 2013. One of them was written in 2020. So again, for people who really want to go further with this conversation, I have additional content where I talk about strategies and tips for talking to kids about colorism. I have resources. I have an introduction to colorism for kids and young adults, right? So all of that is already on colorismhealing.com/blog. But for today, I will leave you with some 2023 tips, right? So first is to consider multiple forms of media. So just like the survey where there were not just TV shows and cartoons, but also storybooks and toys and dolls, right? I remember also my mom intentionally buying us black dolls. Like that was always a given. The only white doll I had was the Little Mermaid, right? But all of our dolls, Cabbage Patch dolls, Barbie dolls, other dolls, all the dolls we had were black dolls. Even in the 80s, even in the 90s, right? So now we have even more access, right? And then consider other things like posters, postcards, toys, dolls, graphic tees. So when you buy your child a t-shirt that has a character on it, how often is that character a black character? How often is that character a dark-skinned character? Room decor. You think about all those blankets and what do you call them? Comforter sets with like all the Disney princesses on them. I mean, do what you want to do. But if I had a black daughter, I would not be buying her a comforter with a big white woman on it. I'm just not going to do it. That's not me. I'm just not going to do it. Now, you know what I mean? Your child loves Elsa. You know what I mean? Do you? But I'm not going to ever buy a black child a comforter with Elsa on it. I'm just not going to do it. Okay? Or Cinderella or Snow White. That's just my approach, my philosophy. And I am strongly encouraging you all to consider when you're buying decorations and toys to decorate your child's room. And let me say this too. Even if you don't have a black child, even if you don't have a dark-skinned child, you're still reinforcing whiteness. You're still reinforcing the notion of white superiority by surrounding them with all white characters and with ideas of whiteness, okay? So even if you have a white child, because of the world we live in, if you want your white child to be anti-racist, if you want your white child to not be racist, it might also behoove you to decorate their room with black superheroes, right? With black characters as well. And so I think all people should be trying to surround themselves with imagery and representation of black people, of dark-skinned people, regardless of your race, regardless of your skin tone. Because again, your textbooks, the average TV show, the average news program, the average Senate race, like society is so inundated and saturated with whiteness and normalizing whiteness and seeing that as the standard that every single one of us, regardless of what we look like or how we identify, has to work harder to appreciate and value blackness and value people with darker skin tones and value other types of marginalized identities, okay? I feel like I'm kind of going in, but I'm gonna keep going. The second tip that I have, if you in any way work with children or have your own children, is to engage and interact. So let children see and hear your responses and thoughtful commentary. So if you are watching a movie, if you are reading a storybook, if you are shopping for Halloween candy or Halloween costumes, right? Actually comment on things, right? So you can use all of these moments as teachable opportunities. If you see a costume in a store that might be offensive, ethnically offensive or racially offensive, like don't just ignore it. Like explain to your child why we're not going to wear these types of costumes, right? Or why we're choosing to buy this doll instead of the other doll, or why we're going to buy this game versus another game, right? Like actually have the conversation. A third tip is to have explicit conversations. So that's kind of one and the same there. And then next, I would say continue to do your inner work and watch for conflicting or contradictory messages. Now, this is one adults don't like to hear. Okay, adults don't like when I talk about this because it's so easy for adults to be like, oh, I just need to teach my kids. I just need to talk to my kids. Meanwhile, I can still have negative thoughts about my own skin tone, or I can still have negative thoughts about my natural hair texture, or I can still harbor anti-Black resentment and expect that my children are going to learn something different. Like, let me tell y'all, parents, teachers, caregivers, you are teaching your child a lot more with how you act and show up in your own body, in your own world, in your own social networks, even than you realize, okay? And then also consider the entire ecosystem of messaging a child receives. A lot of parents say, oh, well, I always tell my daughter she's beautiful. I'm like, that's great. But are you considering the entire ecosystem of messaging that your child receives? Are you also considering whether or not the TV programs that she watches are also telling her she's beautiful? Are her teachers also affirming and confirming her value and worth? Are you introducing her to friendship circles and play dates where the other kids are nice and affirming and confirm her value and worth, right? And so you have to consider the entire ecosystem and not just, oh, well, I told my daughter she was beautiful 2 years ago and she should know that, right? Resist book banning. You know, it goes without saying, I am currently in Texas and other states and other countries, other periods in history where books are being banned. I definitely think we want to, part of what we can do, even if you don't have your own children, is to pay attention to policies and practices and laws and trends in the news that are impacting our collective children as a society, okay? That's also something I'll add is we have to, even if, because I don't have kids, but I believe that all children and the well-being of all children is part of my responsibility, right, as a citizen. And then the last thing I'll say is start early, which is the point of this episode, is that it starts early. It starts before children have the articulate language to describe what they're experiencing at school. It starts before they are able to digest a Bell Hooks book, right? And so, although I will say Bell Hooks has written children's books, she wrote Skin Again and some others. But yeah, start early. And in terms of starting early, let's say your child is 1. You're not going to show them this YouTube live stream, right? But you can start to tell them that they are beautiful. You can start to surround them with Black dolls and put dark-skinned people around them, introduce them to your dark-skinned friends and family, even as a baby, right? Because babies start to notice things like hair texture. Babies are starting to notice things like differences in skin tone. And so if early on they have affirming interactions, even if they're 1 year old or 2 years old or 3 years old, if you're allowing your child and encouraging your baby or your toddler to have affirming interactions with dark-skinned Black people, then you are doing that work, even if you're not like pontificating and sharing research with them, okay? I know I've said a whole lot. One last slide. I will share this. There's one author that I wanted to shout out, author Derek Barnes. So Derek Barnes and I are mutual followers on Instagram. And I think we met at like a book festival in Baton Rouge. But just because like we actually interact sometimes on Instagram, I wanted to highlight him as a person who makes children's content, children's media, books and storybooks, novels and stuff for young adults specifically. He focuses a lot on Black boys, but some of his content also includes Black girls as well. So just a shout out to Derek Barnes. I don't think he's watching, but just in case. All right, so let's get back to the chat, you all, and see what your questions or comments are. And then I will share your reflection question, your opportunity for growth and transformation, and your affirmation. Let's see, where did I leave off? Chaos. Chaos says, with cartoons like The Proud Family, someone like me with a similar name and skin tone as Dejanay, I was often compared negatively to her. Chaos. You don't even need whiteness to be present to notice that dark-skinned characters' presentation can make others treat you differently. So I'm going to put Chaos on the screen here. The Proud Family, I would definitely say, has very often been used as a prime example of colorism and how colorism shows up in the media, in this case, particularly children's media. And one of the things, I talked about the Proud Family in my dissertation, and one of the things that comes up a lot is that a lot of times people say, when they're thinking about casting people in live action films and movies, they're like, oh, we just cast the best person for the role. We just cast the best actor for the role. We just pick the best actress for the role. But when we look at something like The Proud Family or just cartoons in general, you don't have the obstacle of casting because it's animated. You're drawing the pictures. You can choose to make the characters look however you want them to look. And so it's particularly egregious. It's particularly troubling and problematic that in an animated series, you see the same narratives, these same colorist tropes, right? Because even the father in The Proud Family, the darker skinned person, and the grandmother in The Proud Family, the darker skinned person, they were perceived as like comic relief. They were the butt of the jokes. They were seen as more aggressive or more rough, right? And all of the lighter skinned black characters, like the mom, like Penny Proud herself, were always portrayed as more intelligent or always portrayed as more feminine or softer, right? And so definitely, I think there's the need to ask and question. Just because this is a quote unquote black show, just because this is a quote unquote black book or a quote unquote black TV channel, how is it still perpetuating harmful narratives? How is it still perpetuating anti-black narratives? How is it still perpetuating colorism? Colorism will definitely show up even in black media. So yeah, that's why we're doing this, right? So yeah, I feel you on the Proud Family thing. And this was the second half of your comment. Born Earth. Let's see what Born Earth is saying. Born Earth says, one year I got a doll kit and it had a blonde doll wig for Christmas, for Xmas. I wanted a white doll to go with the wig. My parents were like, maybe next year, but that was really no. My dolls were black, right? And so your parents were sending a message even without explicitly sending a message. And so again, as if you are involved in a child's life, you think about what you explicitly say, but also think about what you implicitly say, right? Without actually saying anything, your parents were sending you a message about what they valued, right? Having our own is the only way. This is coming from AB. Separation to fully gain knowledge and power of self. Yeah, I think, AB, I hear this a lot. And the only thing I struggle with is that until we really do our work, it's a conundrum, right? Because I talk about, for example, how HBCUs were blatant perpetrators of colorism. They used the paper bag test. A lot of black sororities and fraternities, black churches. There have been a lot of all black spaces. There have been a lot of black only spaces that still perpetuate anti-black discrimination, that still perpetuate texturism, that still perpetuate colorism, that still perpetuate classism amongst black people, right? And so I think we have to do more than just make it all black. We have to do more than just say, oh, okay, this is a space only for black people. We also have to look at, yeah, we're technically all the same race, but what ideologies are we bringing into that space? What are the conditionings and the social programs that we're bringing into that space, right? Because I have seen a lot of like black only or all black institutions and spaces and events and things like that that are very, very colorist. and very, very sexist and like just marginalize Black people who don't fit as closely to the mainstream as people think they should, right? And so I think it has to be more than just be Black. I think there has to be an acknowledgement of what consciousness are those Black people bringing into that space, right? Yeah. Yeah, I see how you're trying to whittle it down, but again, even a dark-skinned Black person can still think that light skin is better. You know what I mean? So yes, in some ways that helps, but it's not like you can't just assume that just because someone is dark-skinned that they value dark skin. We can't just assume that because someone is dark-skinned that they are not going to discriminate against other dark-skinned people, because I see it all the time, right? We talk about it a lot in terms of dating and how a lot of dark-skinned Black men will be the first ones to say they want a light-skinned woman, right? Or they want a non-Black woman. But I've also seen dark-skinned women purposely procreate with non-Black men so that their children come out mixed, right, with a certain hair texture. And so again, it's not just about, oh, let's just pick people because they're dark skinned or because they're Black. It's like we also have to pick people because of the consciousness that they are demonstrating. Yeah. Meet to re-educate. Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think there's a lot of spaces that require a smaller group of people, right? So people say, oh, we should have everyone at the table. And I'm agreeing with you in the sense that it doesn't always have to be like the whole world convening. I think it's perfectly fine for a space to be all women, or for a space to be all Black women, or for a space to be all dark-skinned Black women, right? And I think it's perfectly fine for a space to be all men, or all Black men, or all dark-skinned Black men. And I think there's nothing wrong with having those conversations just within the group of people who are impacted by the topic that's being discussed. Yeah. And thinking about too, how that can even happen like informally. So a lot of times we think, oh, it has to be like this formal, organized convening. But even if it's just like at the barbershop or at the beauty shop or like sitting around with your friends, right? We can still be doing that unlearning. We can still be doing that re-education. And it doesn't always have to be this like institutionalized project where it's like, oh, on March 5th, we're going to all meet as dark-skinned Black people to unlearn things. This is stuff that we can be doing in our everyday lives, right? Like just you, like me as a dark-skinned person talking to another dark-skinned best friend and like helping each other to do that unlearning and re-educating, right? So yeah, we don't always have to wait for some official external hierarchical event or structure to do that work within. We can be doing that work just amongst our peers and in our day-to-day as well. Great discussion, everyone. As always, I love you all so much. Let me share your reflection question. This is one that I really like. So people always say, oh, we should do more with kids. And when are you going to do more for kids? And what I tell people is that when I influence people who influence children, I am working for children, right? So the reflection question, how can I influence adults who influence children? For example, I myself don't have children, but if I go to a school and do a training or a workshop for teachers to help teachers unlearn their biases, to help teachers understand how to respect and treat dark-skinned children fairly, I am doing work for children, right? I am doing work for children, even if I'm not always doing work with children, right? And so for you, and the reason why I'm making this the reflection question is because I want to create space for people who are watching, regardless of what your relationship is to children. So this is not just for parents. This is not just for caregivers. This is not just for foster parents or grandparents. This is for anybody, whether you want kids, whether you work with kids professionally, whether you have nieces and nephews like I do, right? At some point, you will have influence over an adult who has influence over children, right? And so how can we start to talk to people our age so that they don't perpetuate colorism against the children in their lives, right? And so let's say I'm talking to an adult and I'm like, oh, well, how is this impacting children? Well, if that adult is a teacher or a parent or an uncle or an aunt, then them starting to question and unlearn is actually going to improve the outcomes for the children that they interact with. Okay, and then opportunity for growth for all of us. is to release the shame or the embarrassment or the guilt about intentionally prioritizing dark-skinned Black representation for young children. A lot of times I hear Black parents resist having these conversations, and they resist. They're like, oh, I don't want to seem like I'm being racist by only giving my child Black dolls, right? You have to release that because the rest of the world continues to invest everything it has to force feed us white and light, right? So again, when you look at the entire ecosystem, if you're a Black parent who's like, oh, I want to teach my children to love all skin tones, and so I'm going to buy them dolls of all colors, right? You're setting your child up to internalize the anti-Blackness of the rest of society, okay? Because you're having to work against so much inundation of whiteness that buying your child only Black dolls is not teaching them to be racist. It's one of your only lines of defense for them to not internalize racism, okay? And then lastly, your affirmation. As we heal ourselves, we create better conditions for the children in our care. As we heal ourselves, we create better conditions for the children in our care. And so I'm saying this, adults, because I want you to still do your work. Yes, we can prioritize children. Yes, we can prioritize the next generation. And I wholeheartedly believe that one of the ways to do that, one of the ways to improve the lives and the conditions of our children is to make sure we heal enough, that we do enough inner work to where we're not perpetuating abuse and harm, okay? So that's what I have for you all. Thank you so much for engaging in these conversations. Thank you so much for participating and contributing, even if it's just as a viewer. But definitely, especially shout out to the people in the chat every week, the people who take the time to pose a question or make a comment. You all really help to broaden these discussions and help us to dig deeper. And I will see you next week. Next week we are looking at, I never remember what we're talking about the next week. I don't know what I'm talking about next week, but I put out the agenda. I put out the timeline and the schedule on social media, so you can follow it there. K. Michelle says, I have to think of it as rebalancing my ecosystem, not being racist when choosing to intake mostly Black stuff. K. Michelle, AKA not that one. I love this. I absolutely love what you're saying. Thank you for this language, fam, because you're saying I have to rebalance my ecosystem by prioritizing Black representation in a world, in a larger ecosystem that devalues it and that marginalizes it and that tries to hide it, right, or negate it. That's a great way to describe it. On that note, folks, enjoy the rest of your week, and I will see you in the next video. Mwah. Bye.